Okay, our next presenter is Sun-Young Park, who received her PhD this year from Harvard in the history of architecture and urbanism, and she is now assistant professor and my newest colleague at George Mason, where she's teaching courses in 19th century European history, among other things.
I can adjust the slides myself. My paper is titled Bodybuilding, Architecture, Hygiene, and Physical Culture in 19th Century Paris. And I wanted to start with a quote by historian Maurice Agulon in describing the 19th century industrial city. He wrote, "Sports were born in the city and from the city," end quote. That is to say, the creation of designated spaces for healthful physical activity was inextricably linked to the progress of urban civilization, in which processes of population growth, environmental pollution, and the relentless cycle of labor necessitated new modes and spaces of exercise and leisure. The question of how to pursue health and hygiene in an increasingly unnatural setting was a pressing one in early 19th century Paris, when the city's population doubled from around 550,000 in 1800 to over 1 million in 1850, exerting, as you can imagine, great pressures on the urban environment. This eroding context was well captured in these now familiar images by Charles Marville in the 1860s on the eve of Haussmann's demolition work. And although these images are unnaturally devoid of people, or perhaps because of this absence, they beg the question of what kinds of bodies would thrive, or wither, as the case may be, in this alleged capital of modernity. In my presentation, I'll focus on two new public programs that emerged in this era and in this context, the communal gymnasium and swimming pool, to articulate two related arguments. First, that the creation of these public architectures of health were entangled in larger medical and political debates about regenerating the social body. And second, that the conflation of hygiene and recreation in these venues, as well as the increasingly lavish treatment of their architecture, helped translate these spaces from pedagogical realms to bourgeois sites of urban leisure. The developments that I study were closely tied to the rise of modern hygiene, and I'll begin with a few comments following on Rudy's talk on the breadth of this movement in its inception, since it differs somewhat from our contemporary understanding of the term. As Bruno Latour has described it, the hygiene movement seemed almost coextensive with reality, the way doctors of the time conceived of it. They claimed to be acting on everything at once, including food, urbanism, sexuality, education, the army, clothing, cosmetics, as well as the more familiar topics of sanitation and disease prevention. Latour's focus in his book was on the battle against germs and disease after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when the overriding concern of hygienists was regeneration, again, not just of France, but as he calls it, of mankind in general, and more particularly the urban masses, end quote. And as we've already seen in Rudy's talk, this apprehension over a degenerating nation had much earlier iterations. And my focus is on the period that falls between 1815 and 1848, when hygienists wrote about physical education and fitness in a similar atmosphere of anxiety. Especially following the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire, concerns over the degeneration of the French race prompted new medical thought on the body. Hygienists argued that doctors had failed to consider that human beings, much like animals, could be bred to modify and refine their physical condition. The study of hygiene should in fact also concern itself with the improvement and perfection of the human body. So I'll give you a quote from a doctor of the period who said, "Hygiene is the branch of medicine that teaches us to regulate man's life in order to ensure the free exercise of all of his functions and the complete development of all of his faculties. It is not simply interested in preserving health and preventing illnesses. It also wants to improve and perfect the instruments of life, extract from the human source all that it can produce, and lead the organism to the greatest deployment of force of which it is capable," end quote. So this is from the 1840s, but again, another demonstration, I think, of proto-eugenic thought. And from this premise, doctors particularly emphasized physical education as a means of regenerating French citizens. Drawing on Enlightenment thought, they argued that this effort would not only be beneficial to the physical body, but morally advantageous as well. Methodical and ordered movement was thought to impart greater steadiness to the mind, so that strengthening the body became an act of both physical and moral edification. In the aftermath of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, this joint cultivation of physical and moral hygiene became a particularly pressing medical, social, and political concern. And a primary aim of these theories was to reconstitute order at a time of profound malaise and uncertainty. And I'll be situating the development of early 19th century gymnasiums and swimming pools within this discourse. The first sphere of application for these theories, hygienic theories, was the army, given widespread concerns at this time about depleted French forces. And these initiatives were primarily led by a Spanish emigre in Paris, a Colonel Francisco Amoros, who systematized the gymnastics regimen for French soldiers between 1815 and 1830. Through his lectures and demonstrations, he garnered support from prominent pedagogues and medical theorists of the day, and he led the construction of some of the earliest gymnasiums in the city. The idea of physical education, of course, was not new to the 19th century. From the second half of the 18th century, increasing interest in improving children's physical, bodily, mental development had given rise to pedagogical treatises like this one up here, dealing with all manner of physical activity, loosely gathered under the term gymnastics. So this word could signify games, walking, running, swimming, as well as some of the more structured exercises on equipment that we associate with a word, generally in the open air, as viewed here. And as evident from these images from the turn of the century, the gymnasium and its material culture and these earliest conceptions drew inspiration from nature and from the wilderness. When developing a physical training regimen for soldiers, Amoros drew on these and other Enlightenment references. Given its objective to train soldiers for combat, gymnastics equipment such as vaults, beams, and bars would serve as interpretations of environmental obstacles, such as hedges, ditches, trees, that one might encounter in the wild in situations of war. And many gymnasiarchs, in fact, recommended that students be brought out into natural landscapes periodically to apply their training in forests, rivers, mountains, and forts. Early gymnasiums were thus conceived as abstractions of the battlefield in one sense, inserting nature back into the city and providing a zone of controlled violence for training soldiers. Amoros' first gymnasium was modest in scale and installed in the backyard of a boarding school in the Latin Quarter, where he trained a select group of soldiers and firemen in gymnastics alongside the students. He subsequently established a gymnasium for firefighters in 1819, fitted into an existing military barracks. And following the success of these projects, he was commissioned by the state to establish the first military gymnasium in Paris, which opened in 1820, and which would also serve students. So this map just shows you the location of his various projects. This is the first one in that school in the Latin Quarter I mentioned. This is the one in the military barracks. And the military gymnasium from 1820 is right off the Champ de Mars, off the Place Duplex. And this image just shows, it's a print from the period showing schoolboys running amok in the exercise field that he had developed there. Amoros' vision of gymnastics ultimately extended beyond specialized military training, as you can see in this print. He believed that the ideal gymnasium should serve as a public institution devoted to the urban citizens' physical and moral hygiene, an institution that would be geographically central and accessible to everyone. And given these ambitions, proponents praised Amoros' initiatives as eminently democratic and liberal. In the 1820s, he collaborated with the Beaux-Arts trained architect Martin-Pierre Gauthier to propose an improved communal gymnasium that would simultaneously serve soldiers, students, and the civilian public. Although never constructed, surveying plans and drawings give us an indication of the scale and grandeur envisioned for this edifice. So this is the kind of facade for the structure that he envisioned, a neoclassical temple facade. There would have been an inscription over the door that said mens sana and corpore sano, which translates to a healthy mind and a healthy body. Over the pillars, you're seeing the heads of Hercules, Mercury, Minerva, and Apollo. And these words are descriptions of each deity's qualities or attributes, such as strength, agility, regularity, and grace. And to give you a sense of the scale of this plan below, this facade is basically this portion right here, the entrance to the building. These are open courtyards with fountains and plantings where carriages could drive through. This is an amphitheater where lessons on gymnastics and hygiene would be taught. There are some indoor exercise spaces for the winter months. And adjacent to this entrance structure, this is a sprawling open-air exercise field. All of these forms are gymnastics equipment. And it also had, this is a stadium on top, a racetrack below. And there were 2 swimming pools, one for swimming instruction here, and this large one for naval exercises. In conceiving of his public gymnasium as this exalted temple for physical and spiritual regeneration, Amoros was not simply making a claim for the social importance of this new practice. He was also trying to legitimize and elevate it in the face of growing skepticism. While liberal reformers advocated the muscular male body cultivated through gymnastics exercise, deriding the aristocrats' sedentary lifestyle, the latter, the aristocrats, derided these new practices as vulgar in comparison to the more noble sports of fencing and horseback riding. One learns to jump on wooden horses, a conservative government official sneered. I quote, "You only need to go to Franconi or some other riding school to be shown things that are much more instructive," end quote. And faced with an increasingly reactionary and hostile government in the 1820s, Amoros deployed architecture in his mission to present these new practices of fitness as worthy and estimable activities. By reintroducing nature into the metropolis and offering a means to physical and moral hygiene in an accessible and democratic format, early public gymnasiums were thus implicated in a larger social dispute and can be viewed as one of the sites where the bourgeoisie cultivated a new recreational culture for themselves, rooted in health, movement, and physicality. And to achieve this end, those practices had to be legitimized and packaged as enticing spectacles. The public gymnasiums that developed in Amoros's wake illustrates this transformation of gymnastics from a military regimen into urban spectacle by mid-century. Examples include the Gymnastria, established in 1847 near the Champs-Élysées, which immediately became something of a tourist destination, described by contemporaries as both a temple and theater to bodily fitness. This is another example, the Gymnase Hygiénique, founded in the 1850s in Montmartre, similarly conceived as a large basilica with a grand staircase at the end leading up to spectator galleries. And in 1852, the Grand Prix de Rome competition, hosted annually by the Académie des Beaux-Arts, took on the gymnasium as its program. And just again to show you the scale of this is an open-air exercise field. All of these are different kinds of equipment. And you're seeing a naval ship here where naval exercises could be taught to, again, show you the kind of gargantuan, grandiose ways in this was imagined. So from its modest and at times contested origins, physical fitness had become one of the defining concerns of the modern era, engendering a new architectural discourse on how best to accommodate and encourage its practice. So this process of what might be called spatial legitimation can be observed in the transformation of early 19th century swimming pools as well. As a branch of gymnastics acknowledged to have healthful benefits as well as practical uses, swimming was advocated by military experts and hygienists interested in educational reform. And prior to the expansion of the water distribution network during the Second Empire, gymnasiums and schools were generally unable to incorporate swimming facilities into their premises. And so Parisians had to rely on the city's natural resource, the Seine River, to cultivate this practice. Following a police ruling in 1783 that forbade free bathing in the river within city walls, a series of private enterprises in the form of floating barges multiplied along the river. And this is one shown here underneath the Pont de la Tournelle. While the earliest establishments initially served as bathhouses, the increasing emphasis placed on physical education and fitness in the early 19th century led entrepreneurs to offer swimming instruction as well, and they would reserve certain days of the week for soldiers and schoolboys to make use of their facilities. The earliest swimming schools were rudimentary in form, simple hangars that merely served to form an enclosure. This is an early one shown above. But alongside the burgeoning discourse on physical fitness, the growing popularity of swimming as both a hygienic and recreational practice transformed these establishments into increasingly elaborate social hubs over the years, a transition that will be reflected and promoted through their designs. So this well-known École de Ligny, which started out as this pretty simple wooden barge, was renovated in the 1840s and decorated in Moorish fashion, by two Parisian designers, Humanité René Filastre and Charles Antoine Cambon, who were designers best known for their work on theaters at this time, actually. This style was in keeping with the increasingly lavish treatment of gymnastics facilities, as we just saw, but it also participated in the larger trend of Orientalism in the architecture of recreational programs in the 19th century. So Orientalist designs had emerged first in the Islamic and Chinese-inspired follies of English picturesque gardens. And these early curiosities were adopted by the French and led to the fad for Anglo-Chinese gardens in Paris and the application of Moorish, Arabic, and other Orientalist details in venues such as cafes, public balls, and bathhouses. Drawing on cultural references as diverse as India, Turkey, North Africa, and Spain, the designers of these spaces sought to entice the public by evoking the exotic and offering an escape from the mundane routines of daily life, where the bourgeois could dream of, I quote, the Orient, its delights, its perfumes and its odalisques, opium and its ecstasies, end quote. And this quote is interesting because it calls out the seeming dissonance between the hygienic impulse of swimming exercise and the lavishness of Orientalist designs. Architects and architectural scholars of the 19th century were in fact divided in the appreciation of these newly discovered styles. So the more traditional architects rooted in the neoclassical tradition disparaged trends like these, seeing Arabic architecture as redolent of the idleness, excess, and degeneration typically attributed to the Orient by the West. But alongside those kinds of criticisms, complementary discussions of Oriental architecture in the Romantic period demonstrate a discourse that was not always such a clear-cut binary. For example, Owen Jones and Jules Goury's study of Islamic architecture in the 1830s had inspired the notion that this style perhaps held the key to the science of ornament and color. Césaire Daly, the famed editor of the Revue Générale de l'Architecture et des Travaux Publics, enthused over these drawings, claiming that the sensual sophistication of this style of decoration and construction enhanced both, I quote, the health of the body and the energy of the soul, end quote. This evocation of the potential physical and moral benefits of Oriental architecture, I think, evinces a more complex debate that allowed this style to complement both the idle, passive soaking of traditional bathhouses and the rigorous, stimulating activity of swimming exercise. One of the best expressions of this complexity is this following unrealized design for a swimming school from 1845, which juxtaposed Orientalist details with modern iron and glass construction technology. Whether we read this as an effort to infuse leisure with an active principle, or conversely to infuse exercise with a pleasure principle, I think it aptly illustrates one contemporary writer's description of swimming schools as, quote, one of the most beautiful and above all one of the most healthy gymnastics theaters of the capital, end quote. The acknowledged healthful benefits of swimming meant that these establishments functioned first as gymnasiums, holding out the promise of nature, fitness, and hygiene to everyone. Yet through their sumptuous design and decor, these establishments also became urban theaters, where exercise was not simply a practice of physical hygiene, but also a mode of recreation and entertainment. To conclude, medical theories on physical and moral hygiene became embedded and cultivated in popular culture and the urban environment through these new kinds of public programs. As these activities breached institutional boundaries to become the new recreational practices of urban bourgeois culture, their architectural constructs transformed accordingly. And just as the initial impetus behind these practices derived from political and social concerns, these spaces were never politically neutral, but could function as sites of both class formation and contention. So contemporary enthusiasts often idealize these venues at the time as the ultimate social mixing grounds. It's basically stripped of all these vestimentary markers of class, those who frequented swimming pools would be reduced to the common denominator of their naked bodies. And yet, what bodies they were. David Lombardo has written of the unsavory physiques displayed in these venues as caricatured by humorists of the period. Through these depictions, an unflattering reality revealed itself, and it's the very ugliness of bodies in quest of health and beauty that underscores their parody. In these spaces for the so-called regenerated urban citizen, the imagined and idealized healthy body collided with very real and problematic corporalities, destabilizing the lofty ambitions projected onto this new public sphere. In this particular series from 1847 by Honoré Daumier, the spectacle of regeneration has devolved into a farce, serving as a biting commentary on the physical and moral decrepitude of the dominant class. If these emergent urban venues aim to be the cultivation grounds for a new bourgeois culture rooted in health and physicality, they also ultimately functioned as spaces where those ambitions could be mocked and undermined. Thank you.